The U.S. Army trained its snipers to fight from above. In the Hürtgen Forest, that training got them killed. On the morning of December 14th, 1944, American riflemen were pinned down in frozen woodland near the German-Belgian border. Machine gun fire cut through the trees. Artillery burst overhead. Visibility collapsed to a few dozen yards. The manuals were clear. Snipers climbed. Snipers looked down. That morning, another man refused to. At 7:23 a.m., while bullets tore through branches 6 feet above his head, Private First Class Eddie Brennan lay flat in the mud beneath a fallen oak tree. His rifle was level with the forest floor. His body was pressed so low that anyone standing 10 yards away would have walked past him without noticing. According to doctrine, he was in the worst possible position. No elevation, no wide field of view, no escape route. For the next 4 hours, Eddie Brennan would ignore every rule written to keep snipers alive. He would fire from ground level. He would stay in one place. He would not reposition upward, and it would work. When the firing stopped, 18 German soldiers were dead. None of them ever saw where the shots came from. They searched the tree line. They scanned upward. They aimed too high. Eddie Brennan was never where they looked. That single decision, staying low instead of climbing, would change how Americans fought in forests for the rest of the war. It would also destroy his career. 2 months later, the Army arrested him. He wasn't charged with failure. He was charged with success, with violating sniper doctrine, with encouraging others to fight the wrong way. The battlefield had proven him right. The system could not accept it. This story is not about a lucky shot or an extraordinary kill count. It is about a rule that stopped working, and the moment one man realized that survival depended on breaking it, not by going higher, but by going lower than anyone else dared. The U.S. Army trained its snipers to fight from above. In the Hürtgen Forest, that training got them killed. On the morning of December 14th, 1944, American riflemen were pinned down in frozen woodland along the German-Belgian border. Machine gun fire ripped through the trees from unseen positions. Artillery burst overhead, detonating in the canopy and raining splinters straight down. Visibility collapsed to a few dozen yards. Men could hear the enemy, but they couldn't see him. The manuals were clear. Snipers climbed. Snipers sought elevation. Snipers looked down on the battlefield. That logic had worked in open country. It had worked on training ranges. It had worked everywhere except here. Because in dense forest, height didn't mean control. It meant exposure. That morning, another man refused to follow the rule. At 7:23 a.m., while bullets shredded branches 6 feet above his head, Private First Class Eddie Brennan lay flat in frozen mud beneath a fallen oak tree. His body was pressed so low to the ground that his breath barely disturbed the air around him. His rifle was aligned parallel to the forest floor, aimed not upward but straight ahead. Anyone standing 10 yards away would have walked past him without noticing. According to doctrine, Eddie Brennan was in the worst possible position a sniper could choose. No elevation, no dominant field of view, no clear withdrawal route. Every instructor would have called it reckless. For the next 4 hours, Eddie Brennan would ignore every rule written to keep snipers alive. He would fire from ground level. He would remain in a fixed position. He would refuse to climb, even as the fight intensified around him. And it would work. When the firing finally stopped, 18 German soldiers were dead. Not one of them ever saw where the shots came from. They searched the tree line. They scanned the canopy. They aimed upward, toward ridges and branches and shadows above eye level. They were looking exactly where the rules told them to look. Eddie Brennan was never there. That single decision, staying low instead of climbing, would quietly change how Americans fought in forests for the remainder of the war. It would also destroy his career. 2 months later, the Army arrested him. He wasn't charged with failure. He was charged with success, with violating sniper doctrine, with encouraging others to fight the wrong way. The battlefield had already proven him right. The system could not accept it. This is not a story about luck or extraordinary marksmanship. It is the story of a rule that stopped working, and the moment one man realized survival depended on breaking it. Not by going higher, but by going lower than anyone else dared. The Hürtgen Forest was not just another battlefield. It was a place where normal rules stopped applying. Stretching along the German-Belgian border, the forest was dense enough to collapse distance and narrow enough to erase orientation. Pines and oaks blocked sight lines beyond 30 yards. The ground was uneven, frozen, and soaked with mud beneath a thin layer of snow. Men moved slowly, exhausted, never sure where the next round would come from. Artillery did not behave the way it did in open terrain. Shells detonated in the treetops instead of the ground. Explosions shattered branches into thousands of jagged splinters that dropped straight down. Soldiers, crouching in foxholes, positions meant to protect them, were cut apart from above. The forest did not reward cover, it punished it. German defenses were designed for this environment. Concrete pillboxes were buried into slopes and hidden behind fallen timber. Machine gun teams fired from angles American units struggled to identify. Snipers operated from positions so well concealed that patrols passed within feet of them without realizing they were there. American doctrine had been written for visibility. The Hürtgen Forest offered none. By late 1944, American units entering the forest suffered heavy losses without understanding why. Platoons advanced according to training and stalled almost immediately. Casualties mounted. Replacements arrived and disappeared into the same terrain, repeating the same movements, dying in the same ways. The 28th Infantry Division paid for it in blood. Thousands of men were committed to the forest over the course of months. Many never came back out. Entire companies were reduced to fragments. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes in bodies. The forest did not respond to courage. It responded to mistakes. Eddie Brennan arrived as one of those replacements. He was not a sniper by training. He had not been selected for any special role. He was a rifleman, assigned because there were gaps in the line that needed to be filled. He came from South Philadelphia, from narrow streets where awareness mattered more than strength. Before the war, he hunted deer in scrubland and forest not for recreation, but because his family needed meat. He learned how long a body could remain still, how sound carried, how movement betrayed position, long before anyone realized it. In the Hürtgen Forest, Eddie watched trained soldiers die following instructions that made sense on paper. Men climbed trees to gain observation and were shot within minutes. Men took elevated positions with clear lines of sight and drew mortar fire almost immediately. Men trusted the manual, and the forest erased them. It became clear that the enemy was not simply German infantry. The terrain itself was shaping the fight. German snipers had spent years learning how to disappear into woodland. They fired from ground level, from shadows, from positions that did not break the natural lines of the forest. American troops, trained to look up and outward, searched in the wrong places, every time. The forest rewarded those who became part of it and punished those who stood apart from it. By the time December arrived, Eddie Brennan understood something most men around him did not. This was not a problem of skill. It was a problem of expectation. And expectation in this forest was fatal. American sniper doctrine did not fail quietly. It failed in front of witnesses. The manual was precise. Elevation provided dominance. Height increased visibility. A sniper who controlled the vertical space controlled the fight. These rules were drilled into soldiers before they ever saw combat. In the Hürtgen Forest, those rules killed men in predictable ways. On November 8th, an American rifleman climbed a pine tree to establish an observation position. From above, he could see deeper into the forest than anyone on the ground. It was exactly what the manual recommended. Less than 10 minutes after he settled in, a single rifle shot cut through his chest. He fell nearly 20 feet, hit branches on the way down, and died in the snow. The German sniper who fired was never seen. The position was correct. The outcome was not. Days later, another sniper followed the same logic. He chose a ridgeline overlooking a narrow approach where German movement had been reported. From that height, his field of view extended hundreds of yards. He was confident. He was trained. He was exposed. Within 90 minutes, German observers identified the position and called in mortar fire. Shrapnel tore through his throat before he could move. He drowned in his own blood while the platoon scrambled for cover. Again, the doctrine worked exactly as written. And again, it led to a body. On November 27th, a third man chose a different form of elevation. A blown-out farmhouse offered a second-floor firing position with clear lines of sight and solid walls. From the window, he killed 3 German soldiers. The manual would have considered it a textbook sniper nest. A Panzerfaust team responded. The building collapsed in seconds. When the rubble was cleared, his rifle was found intact. There was not enough of him left to bury. These were not reckless men. They did not improvise. They did not ignore orders. They followed their training precisely. Eddie Brennan knew them. He had shared foxholes with some of them during artillery barrages, pressed shoulder to shoulder in frozen mud while the forest shook. He remembered their voices, their habits, the way they talked about home during the quiet moments. When they died, Eddie did not feel shock. He felt recognition. The pattern was no longer subtle. Every man who climbed became visible. Every elevated position broke the natural lines of the forest. German snipers did not need superior skill or equipment. They needed patience and a predictable target. American training made snipers predictable. The forest punished that predictability without mercy. Each death reinforced the same lesson. Visibility attracted fire. Height invited attention. The very advantage the manual promised was the first thing the enemy exploited. By late November, Eddie Brennan no longer believed the problem was individual failure. The men weren't making mistakes. They were doing exactly what they had been taught to do, and the forest was killing them for it. Something had to change, because continuing to follow the rules meant continuing to watch men climb into positions they would not survive. And Eddie Brennan was done watching that happen. The mistake was not tactical, it was visual. American sniper training assumed one thing without ever questioning it, that danger would appear where a trained soldier expected it to appear, at eye level, or above it, along ridge lines, in trees, from elevated ground. That assumption shaped everything. Where snipers looked, where they aimed, where they believed they were threatened. In the Hürtgen Forest, that assumption collapsed. Eddie Brennan had seen it before the war, long before rifles and uniforms were involved. When he hunted deer in wooded land back home, he learned something most people never consciously register. Animals don't search the sky when they sense danger. They scan the horizontal plane. Movement at eye level, shapes that don't belong. Predators hunt the same way. They don't look down. Height draws attention. A man in a tree breaks the outline of the forest. Even through branches, the human shape creates contrast against the sky. It doesn't matter how well trained he is. Once he's above the ground, he's no longer part of the environment. He becomes a target. On the ground, the rules reverse. Shadows blur together. Shapes lose definition. The forest absorbs movement instead of exposing it. A man lying flat does not announce himself. He disappears into what everyone else has stopped examining. German snipers understood this instinctively. They fired from positions that did not challenge the eye, from places that blended into the forest's natural geometry. They weren't hidden in the forest. They were part of it. American troops, trained to search upward and outward, were looking in the wrong direction. Every time shots rang out, eyes lifted to treetops and ridgelines, rifles angled higher. Fire went exactly where doctrine said it should go, and exactly where the enemy wasn't. Eddie realized that the problem was not that American snipers lacked skill, it was that they were looking for threats where threats used to be. The battlefield had changed. The terrain had changed. The training had not. Survival in this forest did not depend on seeing farther. It depended on being seen less, and that meant abandoning elevation entirely. It meant accepting blindness upward in exchange for invisibility. It meant going lower than training allowed. Once Eddie understood that, the decision was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. Understanding the problem did not solve it. Acting on it meant crossing a line. Eddie Brennan was not a sniper by assignment. He was a rifleman. He had no authority to question doctrine, no standing to propose changes, no protection if things went wrong. The Army had a system for ideas, and it did not involve privates. But the forest did not wait for permission. After watching men die in elevated positions, Eddie approached his company commander. He did not bring theory. He did not bring diagrams. He brought a simple observation. The snipers are dying because they're too high. The response was immediate and rehearsed. Elevated positions provide visibility. Visibility allows control. That was doctrine. That was final. Eddie pushed back anyway. Visibility doesn't matter if the enemy sees you first. German fire is coming from ground level. We're climbing trees and announcing ourselves. The officer listened, not because the argument was convincing, but because too many men had already died. The forest had stripped confidence out of every conversation. Nobody felt certain anymore. Everyone was improvising, whether they admitted it or not. Engaging from ground level was dismissed as impractical. Zero vertical awareness, limited sight lines, no rapid withdrawal. According to the manual, it was a textbook way to get killed. Eddie accepted all of that. Concealment mattered more than visibility. In this terrain, being unseen was the only advantage that lasted longer than a few minutes. The conversation ended the way many dangerous ideas end in war. No approval, no denial, just silence. The officer made it clear he had not authorized anything. He made it equally clear he would not stop it. If you get caught, you're on your own. If you miss, you're on your own. That was enough. That night, Eddie prepared without witnesses. He didn't request equipment. He didn't modify his rifle. He didn't build a position. Anything artificial would draw attention. The forest already provided what he needed. All he had to do was place himself where no one expected a threat to exist. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was trying to survive long enough to prove the forest wrong. By morning, Eddie Brennan would be alone, lying lower than doctrine allowed, waiting to see whether the Army's rules or the forest's would decide who lived. Eddie Brennan did not build a sniper hide. He found one. In the Hürtgen Forest, fallen trees were everywhere. Artillery and wind had torn massive oaks and pines out of the earth, leaving trunks half buried in frozen mud, roots exposed, branches shattered. Most soldiers avoided them. Fallen timber blocked movement. It limited visibility. It felt like a trap. That was exactly why Eddie looked for one. He needed mass. Something thick enough to stop machine gun fire. He needed a natural shape, nothing cut, nothing arranged, nothing that suggested human hands. Any sign of construction would stand out in a forest where everything else was broken but organic. On December 12th, during a patrol, he found it. A massive oak, more than 50 feet long, blown over by artillery. The root ball had torn free, leaving a shallow depression beneath the trunk. Snow had drifted against the lower side, sealing gaps and softening edges. The log rested at a slight angle, creating a narrow space between wood and earth. From 30 feet away, it looked like every other fallen tree. From 10 feet away, it still did. Eddie crawled closer and slid underneath. The space was tight. He had to move on his elbows, dragging his rifle beside him. The ground beneath was frozen hard enough to support his weight without leaving deep impressions. The oak above him was nearly 3 feet thick solid wood that could absorb small arms fire. The root ball behind him erased his silhouette completely. Once inside, Eddie adjusted his position inch by inch. He packed snow and mud around his shoulders and legs, eliminating gaps. He aligned his rifle parallel to the ground, aiming through a narrow, horizontal opening created by the natural curve of the trunk. From that position, his world shrank. He could not see the sky. He could not see the tops of trees. Anything above 4 feet in height simply did not exist. What he could see was the forest floor, tree bases, undergrowth, subtle rises and depressions in the terrain. His field of view was narrow, only a few inches tall, but it stretched nearly 200 yards forward. Any movement at ground level would cross it. Any man walking, crouching, or running would pass through his sightline. Eddie stayed there for hours without firing a shot. He watched a deer move through the snow 90 yards out. It passed without alarm. Later, 2 German soldiers walked close enough that he could hear them talking. Neither looked down. Their eyes stayed level, scanning trunks and branches. They stepped past the fallen oak without slowing. That was the confirmation Eddie needed. The position did not announce itself. It did not challenge attention. It existed below expectation. When Eddie crawled back to American lines after dark, his uniform was caked with frozen mud. His hands were numb. His muscles ached from hours of stillness. But the forest had answered the question doctrine never did. This position did not make him powerful. It made him invisible. And by morning, Eddie Brennan would return to that log, not to experiment, but to fight. Eddie Brennan returned to the fallen oak before dawn. At 4:30 a.m., he crawled back into position in complete darkness, moving by memory alone. He dragged his rifle and ammunition through frozen mud, careful not to disturb the snow packed around the log. Once inside, he settled his body flat, pressed into the ground, and waited. Ground level in December was unforgiving. Moisture crept through wool and canvas. Cold locked muscles into place. Eddie knew he could not move once the shooting started. Any adjustment would expose him. He waited anyway. Dawn arrived slowly. Gray light filtered through the canopy, turning the forest into layers of shadow and muted contrast. The tree trunks emerged first, then the undergrowth, then the subtle rises in the terrain. Eddie's world expanded only horizontally. At 6:15 a.m., he saw his first movement. A German soldier moved between trees roughly 200 yards ahead. The man walked casually, weapon slung, cigarette smoke visible in the cold air. Eddie tracked him through the scope and did nothing. The shot was easy. Too easy. Firing would reveal the position before the fight even started. He let the soldier pass. At Shugo Tre a.m., the forest erupted. An MG-42 opened fire somewhere east of Eddie's position, its distinctive ripping sound cutting through the trees. American voices shouted. Rifle fire answered in scattered bursts. Eddie keyed his radio briefly, reported contact, and went silent. Movement followed the machine gun fire. 3 German soldiers advanced low and fast, using the noise as cover. Eddie tracked the lead man through his narrow sightline. The range was steady, the wind negligible. His rifle was already zeroed for this distance. He fired. The recoil slammed his shoulder into frozen ground. The sound was deafening beneath the log. The German soldier dropped instantly, collapsing forward into the snow. The other 2 froze. They did not look down. They scanned the tree line. They searched branches and trunks above eye level. Eddie worked the bolt. The spent casing bounced off the underside of the oak and landed in the mud beside his face. He fired again. The second German fell backward, clutching his chest. The third turned and ran, disappearing into the undergrowth. Eddie did not chase him. He stayed still. The machine gun fire stopped. Silence spread through the forest, thick and unnatural. Eddie lay motionless, breathing slowly, watching his sector. His ears rang from the blast. The smell of gunpowder hung in the confined space under the log. Minutes passed. Then more movement. 4 German soldiers advanced cautiously, spaced apart, weapons raised. They knew a sniper was present. They just did not know where. Eddie let them close the distance. 160 yards. 140. He fired. The nearest man dropped. Eddie worked the bolt and fired again. The second went down screaming. The remaining 2 hit the ground and returned fire blindly. Their rounds snapped overhead, too high. Eddie waited. One of the Germans shifted position, trying to crawl forward. Eddie fired once more. The man collapsed. The last soldier broke and ran. Eddie keyed his radio. 5. Confirmed. From beneath a fallen tree, Eddie Brennan had just proven something the manual never addressed. The enemy was searching in the right way, just in the wrong place. The Germans adjusted, but not in the way Eddie Brennan expected them to. After the first shots, the forest did not return to normal. Movement slowed. The casual confidence from earlier vanished. German soldiers advanced in tighter formations, weapons raised, eyes alert. They understood there was a sniper somewhere ahead. What they did not understand was where. Eddie stayed still beneath the oak, his body pressed flat, letting time stretch. His position gave him no warning beyond what crossed his narrow sightline. He could not afford impatience. He let the forest decide when the next shot would come. 4 soldiers appeared again, advancing from the same direction as before, this time more cautiously. They moved in short rushes, stopping often, scanning tree trunks, branches, ridgelines. Eddie watched them through the scope, selecting targets, waiting for the first mistake. It came quickly. The lead soldier stopped beside a tree, raised his rifle, and searched upward. Eddie fired. The man dropped where he stood. Eddie worked the bolt and fired again. The second soldier fell backward into the snow. The remaining 2 hit the ground and returned fire immediately. Their rounds tore through branches and bark. None came close. They were still aiming too high. Eddie waited 10 seconds, then 20. One of the Germans shifted, trying to crawl toward cover. Eddie fired once more. The soldier collapsed face first into the snow. The last man broke and ran. 7 confirmed. The forest went quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Tense, expectant. Eddie could feel the cold seeping deeper into his body, locking his joints, numbing his fingers. He flexed his hands slowly, careful not to disturb the packed snow around him. The machine gun opened fire again. American voices shouted for suppression. Eddie scanned his sector. 2 German soldiers ran forward to support the gun position, moving fast, using the noise as cover. Eddie tracked the first man, fired, and watched him drop at 170 yards. The second soldier stumbled when Eddie's round caught him in the hip, spinning him into the snow. 9 confirmed. Eddie worked the bolt smoothly now, his movements automatic. There was no space for it. More movement followed. 3 German soldiers advanced from his right, heading toward the American position. Eddie tracked the leader through undergrowth, adjusted for distance, and fired. The man dropped instantly. The other 2 scattered, diving behind trees. Eddie waited. One of them shifted position, exposing his shoulder. Eddie fired. The soldier screamed and went down. The last man stayed still, pressed against his cover, waiting. Eddie waited longer. 5 minutes passed. Then the German shifted, just enough. Eddie fired again. 12 confirmed. The Germans responded with volume instead of accuracy. Rifle fire snapped overhead. Bullets smacked into tree trunks, tore through branches, kicked up snow. Eddie pressed himself flatter, listening. None of the rounds came low enough. They still believed the threat was above them. A machine gun team attempted to reposition, moving quickly through undergrowth with ammunition boxes slung low. Eddie tracked them carefully. He fired once. The gunner dropped the MG-42 and fell. Eddie fired again. The second man went down. The third tried to drag the weapon away. Eddie fired again. 15 confirmed. By now, the forest was chaos. Mortar rounds impacted in waves. German fire chased the withdrawing American platoon. Eddie's radio crackled constantly with fragments of orders and casualty reports. He ignored it. His world was the narrow slice of ground in front of him. More Germans advanced. Trying to flank, Eddie fired methodically, 1 target at a time, always waiting for movement, always letting the enemy reveal himself. 16, 17. The last shot came when a German officer stepped forward, trying to restore control. Eddie centered the crosshairs on his chest and fired. The officer dropped without a sound. 18 confirmed. The German advance stalled. Fire slackened. The forest finally went quiet. Beneath the fallen oak, Eddie Brennan lay still, cold and exhausted, knowing one thing with certainty. They had changed how they fought. They just hadn't changed where they looked. What Eddie Brennan did that morning did not remain isolated. By the time the platoon finished pulling back, word had already started to move, quietly, without orders, without paperwork. Men asked questions in low voices. Where were you positioned? How did you stay alive? Why couldn't they see you? Eddie didn't lecture, he didn't instruct. He described what he had done, plainly, without embellishment. Ground level, fallen timber, no movement, no silhouette. Other riflemen listened, not because it sounded clever, but because it had worked. Within days, the idea spread through the regiment the way field adaptations always did in war. Not through command channels, but through whispers between foxholes, aid stations, and night patrols. No officer issued instructions, no training circular was written. Men simply stopped climbing. Some tried the method and failed. They moved too much, they chose poor positions, they froze instead of waiting. The forest punished mistakes immediately. Others learned quickly. On December 18th, a rifleman used a hollow log to ambush a German patrol, killing 4 before the survivors withdrew. 3 days later, another soldier positioned himself beneath an exposed root ball and broke a machine gun team that had pinned his platoon for hours. The pattern repeated. German units noticed the change before American command did. After-action reports began to mention fire originating from ground-level positions. Counter-sniper teams searched trees and ridgelines as before and found nothing. German snipers adapted, but the adjustment came too late. The Americans had already learned how to disappear. By January 1945, German units reported a sharp increase in sniper casualties in forested sectors. Traditional countermeasures were no longer effective. Indirect fire was recommended. Systematic clearing of fallen timber was suggested. Neither worked fast enough. The forest had shifted the balance. American infantry units that adopted ground-level concealment suffered fewer losses. German advances slowed. Machine gun teams hesitated. Movement became cautious, uncertain. The change did not have a name. It did not have approval, but it was real. Eddie Brennan watched this from the sidelines. He did not claim credit. He did not argue for recognition. The outcome mattered more than the acknowledgement. Men were surviving who would have died weeks earlier. That was enough. For the army, however, this created a different problem. The tactic worked, but it had not been authorized. And success without permission was something the system could not tolerate. The Army did not question the results. It questioned the process. On February 15th, 1,945 military police arrested Eddie Brennan at battalion headquarters. There was no dramatic confrontation, no resistance. Eddie had expected it. Success without authorization never went unnoticed for long. The charge was not cowardice. It was not failure under fire. It was violation of doctrine, unauthorized modification of sniper tactics, disregard for established procedure, conduct unbecoming of a soldier encouraging others to do the same. The language was precise, administrative, detached from the battlefield that had made the decision necessary. The court-martial convened 4 days later at division headquarters. 3 officers presided: a colonel, a major, a captain. None of them had fought in the Hürtgen Forest. None of them had watched men die following the manual. The charges were read aloud. Eddie Brennan pleaded guilty, not because he believed he was wrong, because the facts were not in dispute. Yes, he had fired from ground level. Yes, he had remained in a fixed position. Yes, he had explained the method to other soldiers. The officers pressed him anyway. Did he understand that doctrine existed to maximize effectiveness and minimize risk? Eddie answered simply. He understood that the doctrine had gotten men killed. He named them, not as an accusation, but as a record. The room went quiet. Kill counts were discussed next. 18 confirmed enemy casualties from a single position. The officers acknowledged the number without comment. Effectiveness was not the issue. Authority was. You are a private, Eddie was told. You do not decide how wars are fought. Eddie did not argue. He stated one thing clearly. He had followed the only order given to him: do not get caught and do not miss. The company commander denied issuing such permission. Eddie expected that. The system required deniability. After a brief recess, the court adjourned. Eddie Brennan was remanded to custody pending sentencing. Outside the room, the war continued. Soldiers fought from ground-level hides. German advances stalled. Men survived using a method the court refused to acknowledge. Inside the system, however, the message was clear. Innovation without authorization would be punished, even when it worked. Eddie Brennan served his sentence without protest. 30 days in confinement, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay. When it ended, he was reassigned away from the front. The war moved east without him. The fighting continued in forests where men now stayed low, hid beneath fallen timber, and survived using a method that did not officially exist. No report credited him. No citation followed. Eddie Brennan returned home after the war like millions of others. He wore his uniform one last time, carried a duffel bag, and stepped back into streets that looked unchanged and felt completely different. He went back to work. He married. He built a quiet life that did not invite questions. When people asked about the war, he answered simply, "I was in the infantry. I did my job." As quote. He never mentioned the Hürtgen Forest. He never mentioned the 18 men who died without seeing him. He never mentioned the court-martial. Years passed. In 1957, the U.S. Army published a revised sniper training manual. Buried inside was a new section describing ground-level concealment in dense forest terrain. It recommended the use of fallen trees, root systems, and natural depressions as firing positions when elevation created unacceptable risk. The technique was described clearly. Its effectiveness was acknowledged. Its origin was not. No name was attached to it. The manual treated the idea as an institutional evolution, not an individual decision. The forest had taught the lesson. The army had learned it. The man who paid the price for discovering it was unnecessary to record. Eddie Brennan's life continued quietly. He raised children. He ran a small business. He fixed machines instead of weapons. Neighbors described him as reliable, reserved, unremarkable. That was exactly how he wanted it. Decades later, historians would trace the technique back to a single morning in December 1944. They would find after-action reports, German casualty records, court transcripts. They would calculate how many lives the method likely saved, but by then, Eddie Brennan was already gone. The system had moved on without correcting the record. The war had ended. The manuals had been rewritten. The name had been removed. All that remained was the method, and the silence around the man who made it work. Years after the war ended, the technique remained. It spread quietly into training courses, field manuals, and specialized units. In forests across Europe and later in other conflicts, soldiers learned to fight from ground level. They learned to disappear beneath fallen timber, to abandon elevation when it betrayed them, to wait instead of climbing. The method became standard. The name did not. Eddie Brennan died in 1989. He was 67 years old. His death was sudden, ordinary. A heart attack while working under a car in his garage. His obituary mentioned his family, his business, and his service in World War II. It noted that he had received a Bronze Star. It did not say why. His grave bears the same markings as thousands of others. Name, rank, dates, nothing more. There is no reference to the forest. No mention of the 18 men who died without seeing him. No record of the court-martial that punished him for being right. But in forests around the world, soldiers still use the position Eddie Brennan chose under a fallen oak tree in December 1944. They lie flat. They stay low. They wait. Most of them will never hear his name. They do not need to. They know the technique works. That is enough for a battlefield. War does not remember people the way history claims it does. It remembers what works. Rules change. Manuals are rewritten. Credit disappears. But the decisions made under fire remain, passed from one generation to the next without attribution. Eddie Brennan did not change the war with authority or permission. He changed it by refusing to die following a rule that no longer fit reality. And that is how wars actually move forward, quietly, illegally, from the ground up.